Hello, this is John Anhalt for DriveHUD.com, and I'm going to be going over a user-submitted hand history and analyzing it and giving some feedback and advice on it. I like doing these video reviews. I think I can get a whole lot of information, a whole lot of helpful information in a short amount of time, and so we're going to break apart this hand and analyze it, do some basic equity calculations on it, and talk about why one line is a little bit better than another. This is kind of a common spot where you hit a monotone flop, so I thought it would be kind of an interesting hand to discuss. So here, this is a 10NL cash game, full ring, where there's 8 players active. Our opponent in this case is in late middle position, MP3, so this is one before the cutoff. And our hero is in the big blind and elects to call with pocket jacks to the MP3 open. And effective stacks are 100 big blinds in this case. So like I said, our hero flat calls in the big blind with pocket jacks. One of the first comments questions from hero was, maybe he should have 3-bet pre-flop, and yes, a 3-bet here for value is preferable. As far as EV against a late middle position opener, 3-betting here is just purely for value. Occasionally flat calling is fine, but I think in these smaller stake and micro stake games, just play your hands pretty straightforward. In this case, hero does have some history with opponent, not noted history, but just they have 450 hands. They have the stats of 24-15, so VPIP 24, preflop raise of 15, 3-bet of 5.1%, and aggression factor of 2.7. So, the first thing you always want to do is classify what kind of player this is you're facing. So if I'm looking at these stats right off the bat, I'm looking at the fairly larger VPIP preflop raise ratio there. So we know that our opponent is probably cold calling a little bit too much. Players at full ring will have a tendency to do this, or sometimes in microstake games, the games get a little limpy and people will limp behind with some more marginal stuff. But better players will get out of the habit of doing this, so they'll be 3-betting on ISOing or folding those hands. So we kind of know this player is a little bit too loose, playing a little too many hands, especially at 24% VPIP. They're not super aggressive pre-flop with their 3-betting at 5.1. That's kind of on the for full ring in the middle lower rung. And aggression factor is kind of squarely in the middle there also for full ring. It's not really aggressive and not really passive, maybe slightly leaning towards passive, but pretty squarely in the middle. So overall, this is somebody who's playing a few too many hands, not doing anything out of the ordinary or crazy, is not super aggressive pre or post flop. So anyway, so hero calls, the flop comes monotone king high. Hero checks and opponent bets about 2/3 of the pot, and hero calls. So first thing, I'm going to advocate for actually donk betting on these kinds of monotone boards. Clearly checking in the pre-flop raiser, even if they're not aggressive, is a pretty standard play. Let them c-bet a lot of their range. But against somebody who's average to lower aggression on these monotone boards, where they're not going to probably be bluffing later, that you can pick them off with a jack high flush draw, it's better just to go ahead and basically bet your hand for value. In these cases, you're not going to get raised off your hand very often, especially at these kinds of stakes. You still will get a lot of second best hands to call you, 9x, 7x. Even some middle pairs like 8s and 10s and things like that could call. A lot of people don't really know how to handle donk bets very well, especially at these stakes. So, take advantage and exploit that when you can. But really leading here is more about value and thinking long term, like, okay, what kind of player am I against? This is not somebody who's super aggressive. I'm not going to be looking to like check call to pick off a bluff because they're going to do some kind of multi-street bluff, and I can, you know, if I end up hitting a flush or something with my jack high flush, I can get them to bluff off a lot of chips or something and call them down. That's not the kind of player you're against here. And so your hand's kind of vulnerable. It's not something where you just want to allow somebody to possibly even check through. You just want to get value, you know. If this kind of player, think about it this way, if they aren't somebody who's aggressive and they're going to c-bet one time here, which again, someone c-betting on monotone boards, especially someone who's kind of passive, is going to go down in these spots. It's not going to be as high as it normally would on, let's say a two-tone board and, something not with a lot of mid cards or whatever. That c-bet percentage is going to go down. They're also not going to be bluffing on these later streets as often, so there's just not a lot of incentive to possibly give them a free card or not try and get value from hands they might check behind, like say 9-8, so, or 7-8 would probably be a little more accurate there. And maybe even something like pocket sixes where they have a six of diamond, they might call, but they might check behind here. So all those kinds of hands, it just makes more sense. It's not horrible check calling here. I'm just saying in terms of EV and considering, donk betting, which I know a lot of people aren't necessarily super happy about, but this is one of those spots. A spot like if you had like King 10, for example, King 10 offsuit, this would be another spot. Just go ahead and bet here, because a lot of your opponents just aren't going to bet, especially if they had opened like from the button. That even increases the times that you should just kind of be leading on these monotone boards when you actually have a hand, but it is somewhat vulnerable. So our opponent calls, and then the turn comes the 10 of diamonds. So now we have a jack high flush, hero checks, and opponent bets, and hero calls. So here, once our opponent bets the flop, and we go ahead and check the turn against someone who's in that middle aggression factor, I like a check call here a little bit more, because even these players that are somewhat in the middle of aggression, and even on the more passive side, a 4-tone board is a spot where a lot of these players will open up their bluffing range a lot more than they typically would. A lot of players know, hey, especially if someone's only called and they've been checking and checking, this is a spot where I could try and steal a pot. So of all spots, a check call here for one street is pretty solid. What's interesting is, the range that you're going to have them on the turn, and your equity isn't going to change much to the river. So whatever you have now, keep that in mind when you're on a four-tone board and you don't have a nut flush in this case. Whatever range that you're going to assign them on the turn, that's going to be pretty much the exact same range they're going to have on the river, especially if they fire. So equity wise, you're really not going to change much. So you kind of want to, put out your plan here. And I think, check calling at least one street, knowing that your opponent, this kind of opponent, won't tend to 3-barrel bluff very often, which will lead to the last result here. And I'll bring up DriveHUD real quick. So bringing up DriveHUD and punching this hand in, we can see we have about 46, almost 47% equity versus our opponent's range, and this is a range primarily made up of pairs with ace of diamonds, some flopped flushes, one bluff, and we can probably add in a couple more bluffs in there and just increase our equity, but keeping it on the very conservative side here, even though, again, even kind of middle of the road aggressive players and less aggressive players will open up their bluffing range a little wider on a 4-tone board, especially when you're checking. The point is, you're getting a little over 2-to-1, so you have plenty of equity there to call. Now, if it was a little more narrow and our opponent was really aggressive and you knew you were going to be, facing a river barrel a high percentage of the time that you were, going to be folding to, then you should be folding this turn because your equity is really not going to change very much. The only thing that's going to change is your estimate of how often you think that they're going to bluff all three streets, and especially the river after you've called a significant size turn bet. So in this case, I think it's pretty safe to conclude that on the whole, as a population of these kinds of players, they're not going to fire a third time here. So, check calling and then planning to check fold the river, assuming it's if it's a decent sized bet. We start getting to a little bit over 2/3 and under the pot size for a river bet. You can consider calling, but as played here, again, hero check calls turn, river comes, queen of spades. I'll put this in and you can see it really won't, or sorry, queen of hearts. It won't really change the equity calculation pretty much at all. So MP3 shoves and then hero folds. So yeah, it's definitely a fold here, and a couple of reasons why. In general, when a player can bluff for an amount that there's definitely only a few different hands that you're going to have here that maybe you would have considered calling. One of them being something with the jack of diamonds, like king jack, is a lot of what I would have put my opponent on with the jack of diamonds, or something like maybe even pocket eights with the eight of diamonds, where you're kind of inside, you have a open-ended straight flush draw. Hands like that might fold to, let's say, a pot size bet or maybe a $5 bet. When you can bet slightly smaller amount, save some money when you are called, and get that same effect. Generally, if people are betting more, then it's a little bit safer to assume that they are not bluffing, which especially at these stakes, this kind of player, I think you can pretty safely conclude, they had a big hand. They ended up having something with the ace of diamonds. Either they semi-bluffed on the flop or they, flopped it all the way. Either way, occasionally if your opponent does bluff here, you're just gonna have to tip your cap to them unless you have some other specific read, which in this case we don't have any info on our opponent other than just stats. So we're just taking kind of a player profile perspective, applying that in this scenario, and saying, hey, look, I don't, our opponent, based on what they probably do have and how they play this hand, isn't gonna bluff here enough for me to call this given these odds. So you don't have the odds to call anymore, and even if I took out one of these bluffing hands too, it's gonna get way worse. So yeah, that's kind of overall analysis of what's going on here. I think the main thing, and the reason why I want to do this, was kind of covering common monotone board scenarios and facing kind of a standard reg, maybe somebody who's not super great, but is competent enough, but isn't necessarily somebody who's going to make a ton of plays. Kind of how you should approach those scenarios. So hope you got something from this video, and wish you much success with your poker game.